John, the beloved disciple, wrote his gospel in what is believed to be between 70 and 90 AD. At the time, John was head of the church in Ephesus in the Asia Minor. He was writing his gospel initially to the Jews and Gentiles in Ephesus. John had a very specific purpose in mind when writing his gospel. The Synoptic Gospels had already done a good enough job telling the early church about Jesus' life and ministry. John wanted to write for a slightly different purpose. John recognized that Jews were a big part of his audience, so he presented Jesus as the Jewish Messiah to them. With Jesus being presented as the Jewish Messiah, he was the fulfillment of the Old Testament law and covenant. And he also presents Jesus as the new temple and the center for the people's worship of God. Gentiles were also reading though, and John knew that, so he wasn't going to leave them out. After all, they needed to hear the good news as well. John translated from Aramaic to Greek, so that way the Gentiles would be able to understand and he could reach them. Because of John's inclusiveness into his gospel, he is seen to have a very evangelistic intent with writing it. John wants everybody to be able to hear the good news and come to a saving faith. But it doesn't stop there. John also wants everybody to not only come to a saving faith, but to develop and grow into a more mature faith and a well-informed faith. Now that we've established our background, let's take a look at the passage. To give some context of where we just came from, Jesus and the disciples are fleeing from a pretty hostile situation. Jesus, in chapter 8 of John, was making claims of being the light of the world, and the Pharisees didn't like that so much, and they were threatening to kill him. So Jesus was trying to hide who he was while being around the Pharisees. And then that same day that they were fleeing, they also ran into a blind man. And that's where we're turning to. John chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. As he passed by, he saw a blind man from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming, when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. So what's going on? We have a blind man, and he's blind from birth. And the disciples jump right to this assumption that because he's blind, he must have sinned or his parents must have sinned, since he's been blind from birth. This sort of thinking falls along the lines of, why do bad things happen? See, the disciples see this as a cause and effect behavior, and Jesus debunks this immediately. This is a lot like Job. Job suffered a lot, and his friends were basically blaming him, saying, "You've done something wrong to lose everything." So here are the disciples blaming this man or his parents for his blindness. Jesus says this is nothing to do with sin, but it's to be able to glorify the Father and show the signs of the works of the Father through the man. So what does that mean about our suffering? When things go bad, can we pinpoint a reason? We want to pinpoint a reason. We want to be able to point to a specific situation and say, this is why this happened. Because of X, Y has happened. We especially like to do it in the lives of others. This brings us a sense of comfort and almost a sense of control. So we can say, well, if I just don't do this one thing anymore, I won't suffer, or I won't have to feel like this anymore. But that's not right either. Because while sin can be the reason we suffer, it's not always the reason we suffer. And as we see, sometimes we're suffering simply so that way a work of God can be done through us, and we can experience His mercy and His power to the fullest extent, and that way we glorify Him, and it's not because of a sin. Suffering is just a reality of our experience. The next thing we see is Jesus not simply healing the blind man, but first He invites the disciples to be a part of that work as well. Jesus very clearly says, "We must work the works of He who sent me." We. He's letting the disciples know that they have a role in healing this man and doing God's work. And this is also our invitation to do this redemptive work and to take part in the healing and bringing those in darkness to the light. Another key thing to keep in mind is that Jesus is doing this during the day, when it's light out. And this blind man has been in darkness his whole life, and he's bringing him into the light to be able to see for the first time. But Jesus is doing this work during the day. So there's a very stark contrast. He is the light, he's working during the light, because there's no good to be done at night. What's also interesting is that Jesus is doing this work on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is supposed to be the day of rest, but God is always at work. He's always judging because somebody is dying on the Sabbath, or he's giving life because somebody is being born on the Sabbath. So Jesus is performing these miracles and these signs, and he's basically saying, I am God because I can work on the Sabbath. Is it better to do good on the Sabbath or do nothing? Blindness was a widespread problem back in Jesus' day. It was much more prominent than we think about it today. It's because of much of the uncleanliness that the people lived in. So a lot of it could be bacterial, some of it could be from birth, and if you were blind, because people didn't know and people wouldn't talk to you, you were seen as unclean, which is why nobody would associate with you, and you were reduced to begging, much as the blind man was. So you have a very low social status when being blind. There's no help for you. You're left pretty much to die. So this man is in the dark physically because he can't see. He's in the dark socially because nobody will talk to him. So the fact that Jesus and the disciples even stopped to give him the time of day is huge. And it becomes a spiritual metaphor for Jesus as well, because spiritually we're in the dark and he's come to bring us into the light. And that's what he's done for this man. Jesus heals the man, and he asks the man to obey a command, and the blind man does it without question. He's promised sight, and that's what he wants. So when Jesus tells him to go to the pool of Siloam, he does it, and he comes back and he's healed. And it's because of his obedience to be willing to do it. So spiritually, he's enlightened. He not only has the light of sight, the eye, but he has light in his heart now for God. He's obeyed Jesus and he's followed Jesus now, and so he has access to the Father. So what does this tell us about Jesus, and how does this point us to Jesus? We see Jesus as the ultimate healer, the ultimate source of mercy and grace, forgiveness and power. He is our light, and all he asks is that we obey him, and that we may have access to the Father through that obedience. When we're feeling pretty low and things aren't going our way and we're sick and we're tired, we're exhausted, we lose somebody important in our life, whether it be to death or they just leave, we lose our job, we do poorly in a class, we want to find an answer as to why this is happening. It's easy for us to point to our sin and be able to say, this is why I lost my job, or this is why that person no longer is in my life. And really, it's not always the case. So because we don't know, we can't be quick to jump to this conclusion that it's this specific reason. We have to be able to obey God in that suffering, and to be able to keep an open mind and an open heart to see where he's leading us out of this. We can't be focused on why it happened, but we need to be focused as to how we're going to get through it. God is using our suffering to create in us an inner glory towards him, and to renew our spirits day by day, so that way we orient ourselves more towards him and we're more open to obeying him. And to say that suffering is the direct result of sin kind of reduces Christ's death on the cross, because we're saying Christ did not fulfill the law, because we're subjecting ourselves to the law at that point, that because of this is our punishment, and we don't want to do that. This passage should be fueling our mission as the church. Christ is inviting us to do this work of bringing light to the darkness, and to bring those lost in, and to heal their afflictions. We do this, and we don't want to hesitate, we don't want to question it, much as the disciples did, trying to find the blame for this. We look at each person and we see the potential that they have for God and what they could do to glorify him. we don't want to reduce them to past mistakes. And we also don't want to say, it's their fault they're in this, they can get themselves out. It's our responsibility to help them and to care for them and to love them. Bad things and suffering are just a reality of our existence here. And Jesus came to upend that, to destroy that and overthrow that and make beautiful out of what is ugly. And that our suffering is a way to do that. In our suffering, it's ugly and it's bad, but the beauty is that we come out of it, we obey God, and we glorify Him in that. If we're willing to do what Jesus asked us to do, much like the blind man was so willing to go to the pool of Siloam, then we have access to the redemption and the grace promised in the cross. Oh, goodness gracious. What? Jesus and the disciple. There better be 8 minutes, or else I will choke a fool. Oh, crap. I skipped ahead. Oh, wait. That's a bad metaphor. I suck, man. Jesus. Oh, blah. Blah. I quit. Chris, something just hissed at me. It hissed. Jesus was also the fulfillment. I can't do it, Chris.
Can't do it?
Booyah!